the Emeritus Professor at the Open University, joint editor of Oral History. Joanna and I paths nearly crossed in the 1970s when Joanna was doing work on the General Union of Textile Workers, whilst I was doing the work on the political side, and our work was kind of parallel. So I followed Joanna's career, a part of it, as we've gone on, and I'm really looking forward to today and to hear what Joanna's got to say and the challenges we face, because she's had real experience over the years, the challenges we face in oral history. So without any more to do, I'm going to ask Joanna to carry on. Joanna.
Thank you, David. Well, thanks very much, and thank you people for inviting me to what to me seems like a really exciting and interesting day. And I've been really lucky because it's enabled me to bring together something, work I've been doing recently in a completely different way, which I'll explain in a minute. And I should also explain that my co-presenter, it's terribly sad that she's not able to be here. She's been very seriously ill and is only just getting better now. And so, although she's contributed to the PowerPoint as far as she could, she's sadly not able to be present, but she's hoping to hear the recording of the day. So I'm sure she'll find it really interesting, as I have so far. Just a tiny anecdote, thinking about Colne Valley in the 1970s, and you saying that people felt a bit overawed and by the process of being interviewed. I had one of these sort of Damascene experiences in a sheltered housing unit in the Colne Valley in Slowett, when, having gone through all the usual sort of social, they're trained to do as an oral historian back then in the 70s, thanking someone for the interview, I was absolutely shocked that she thanked me. I had not expected, had this completely focused notion, I'm there to extract these histories and to reproduce them in some way, that she was actually participating in that interview and benefiting from it as she saw, was astonishing to me. I have to confess, it's terrible really, isn't it? That hadn't occurred to me till then. So that was that's one of the things I learned from being a PhD student then. But on now to something completely different. I'm not a historian of children or young people, and I'm certainly not a historian of experiences of death. However, Jane Rivers McCarthy, as she's published, very much is. And she has been developing her project around this for some time and invited me to do some work with her. So in this paper, I'll just outline the CAPED project, as it's called, Children and Personal Experiences of Death. I'll talk a little bit about oral history and secondary analysis, or reuse, and then talk about the work I've been doing just for this very, very short consultancy with Jane for the project. Because what's been fascinating for me is it's made me come up face to face with some of the really nitty-gritty basic issues about oral history archive reuse. Things I had often talked about, I'd done a small amount myself, but I hadn't actually put some of these experiences together or had an opportunity to really explore the area in the way that Jane's consultancy enabled me to. So the Children and Young People's Personal Experience of Death project, what I could do is just read out a piece that Jane wrote as a sort of background to this, just to explain. As you can see, I've put up the three objectives for that project that she, and I'll put that up, and confusingly I'll read what she said. She says, in recent decades, much has been documented and explored about the historical context and processes through which children's lives on the one hand and encounters with death on the other have changed over time. This work has demonstrated how children in the UK became increasingly institutionalised with industrialisation and urbanisation, with particular discourses and ideals attached to the early years of life. Other scholars have also documented how experiences of death and cultural and institutional responses to death changed, particularly over the course of the 20th century, with the emergence of discourses of bereavement towards the later decades. At various times over the 20th century, death has been argued to have been more or less taboo, with death and dying sequestered into particular sites and institutions. For both childhood and for death, institutionalised processes and practices, along with variable cultural understandings and representations, have undergone significant changes over the century as a whole and into the present day. Yet while each of these topics constitute established bodies of work in their own right, very little has been done to bring these together and to consider how children and young people's direct experiences of and responses to deaths in their families and social networks have been shaped over time, and to investigate the significance of such experiences over generations and over individual biographies in historical and cultural contexts. This project will seek to fill this gap. She's talking about the main project that I'm just attached to, within an overall exploration of how far changing constructions of childhood are themselves troubled if potentially difficult experiences such as death are encountered, and how this conundrum may have shaped children's experiences in Britain over this time period. If death has been taboo in many respects and childhood has been idealised, bringing these two issues together may thus represent a significant double jeopardy. So what have been the implications for children and young people's personal experiences of death? This research will tackle this important and neglected topic to explore and document early encounters with death in the UK during this time period, including the broad historical, cultural and institutional processes which contextualised individual experiences and through which childhood bereavement, as it's now called, has emerged as an important area of medical and welfare practices. Along this general perspective, the research will also consider how individuals of varying ages have narrated such encounters with death, examining the personal significance over the life course of such experiences and the implications over variable lengths of biographical time. Hence the request made to me to explore the possibilities of using oral history archives for this purpose. In this regard, drawing on existing archive materials in which people talk to a greater or lesser extent and more or less spontaneously about personal encounters with death experienced before the age of 18. And this will provide a really unique window into this neglected feature of children's experiences in 20th century Britain, and how these are contextualised in individual biographies and social contexts. And further, this will offer a major departure from the general research, such as it is, available on childhood bereavement. So this new perspective on children's personal encounters with death will provide a really important backdrop and framework for thinking about the parameters and underpinning assumptions of that more specialised topic. Well, I felt I needed to represent Jane's interest as a researcher and to provide the context, a sort of theoretical context, which this very small piece of research that she asked me to do is situated. It's part of thinking which she's been developing over a number of years. In fact, she'd already put up one bid to research this using oral history data, but had been, this was turned down by ESRC on the grounds of how will you know that the cases will be there? And so what my job has been is actually to find out, are the cases there? And what attracts her, she says, to using archived oral history interviews is the notion of serendipity, the spontaneity, as she called it in that piece. These are interviews in which childhood death wasn't the prime focus. It'll be mentioned because people will have encountered this, but it won't have been the main focus. And she feels that this is a much stronger, theoretically, methodologically approach to take than what she sees as what she calls the voluntarist approach in social science, where people are recruited through established organisations, childhood support agencies, for example, and are volunteer to be interviewed or are found within a known population. And it's that, and it's always been that notion of serendipity which I've also found so very interesting in the whole issue and an area of the reuse of archive data. So just to look briefly at my own interest in this, which has developed over a number of years, and in fact I spoke at a previous novella seminar talking about my experience with secondary analysis, and realised actually I've been doing it unwittingly since the 1970s. In fact, I used Paul Thompson's interviews to find West Yorkshire, Colne Valley, people who'd worked in the mills. So I was actually using the interviews which he'd done carried out in the early 1970s at the University of Essex when he did his major study. And then in turn, I was approached by a young American researcher who was doing a comparison of German and UK textile industries. He used my interviews in that same period or just afterwards. So I've been involved in that sort of turning around and reusing in a sort of unofficial way over a number of years, but more recently through the Timescapes programme and through another study I did with South Asian geriatricians, have engaged directly in secondary analysis. And here are some of the reasons why those of us who are interested in reuse think it's worthwhile, that you can use it as a methodological tool. You can assess the credibility of new research, the generalizability of small studies by looking at established data. You can supplement your own primary data. Well, I certainly did that by using Paul Thompson's data, and when this guy, Richard Bernacki, used my data, I was supplementing data by accessing other people's often quite rich data. You can, and just to go on to the next point, provide rich descriptive information. Well, one of the data sets I'm going to be talking about is Elizabeth Roberts' interviews that she did in the 70s and 80s in Lancashire. Very, very rich historical data, and fantastic if you're actually preparing a study or you want to just know more about a particular area. So having access to somebody's existing data or deposited data is value for that reason. Methodological insights, as David was talking, going back, looking at his own earlier interviews, you do learn a lot about how to and how not to be an oral historian or how to research. So actually reading around the interviews, looking at how people have carried out studies is itself useful, instructive. Hard to reach populations. Wendy Rickard, for example, her interviews with sex workers and with people HIV positive, these are groups of people who may or may not want to be interviewed again, but their interviews are now deposited at the British Library. These hard-to-reach populations, or people who've undergone very difficult experiences, not wanting necessarily to be interviewed again, their interviews are available if archived. And generating new findings from old data, something which I find particularly interesting to do, and which I've done, as I was saying, with the geriatricians' data, where going back to those original interviews and reading them in a different way, and that leads in again into this CAPED project. So what I was asked to do was to look at some of the sources that might be used to construct an oral history database for the CAPED project. Where are these interviews? What might be the most suitable sources of interviews, and how usable are they? And to see how relevant they are to the research questions, to draw up a table of interviews. So I wondered actually to start with, surely somebody's written some kind of guidance about how do you approach other collections? Is there some kind of, set of rules about it? Having done it myself, I was surprised that I hadn't thought about this before. And I was reading through some of the literature, came up again, here we are, Paul Thompson again, and writing in 2000, he's how to choose or find the most suitable collections. This is what he's saying then. The most valuable qualitative data sets for future reanalysis are likely to have three qualities. Firstly, the interviewees have been chosen on convincing sample bases. That slightly goes against the voluntary serendipity one. Second, the interviewees are free-flowing but follow a life story form. So again, something with particular structure to an interview then, rather than focusing on the researcher's immediate themes. And thirdly, when practicable, recontact is not ruled out. So that was, for me, is the only statement I'd come across where some kind of, not exactly protocols, but some kind of notion of what might be the way you approach existing data sets. And I'll come back to this statement later. So I don't know how you can read it, good. I used to think you can. These are the collections I've looked at and visited so far. Not all online. The Elizabeth Roberts collection isn't online. And I just want to talk about some of them. Just go through this, and I'm going to talk about them in more detail in relation to some observations I've made. I've divided them into two groups, what I call national collections. That includes the, and please, at the end, I hope I don't talk on too long. I should have said at the start, I really, really want to hear from you. I do want you to tell me things about collections, about things that I've probably got wrong. This really is a kind of, as they say, a work in progress paper. So please, this is for me a learning experience, and do interrupt me as well. First of all, I've got here UK Data Services. This includes what we used to call Qualidata, which has got a number of collections. I mean, I put these in because these are the ones which are searchable online. And these seem to me to be the ones which might be most productive. And you can see the size of the collections there. Those are the number of interviews, not the number of ones which might be productive. And they're from different time periods. Those of you who are interested will know. And then timescapes, which I mentioned earlier, which is the one that some of us in the room were involved in. And potentially, these are the projects. There were 7 projects engaged with timescapes. I actually haven't put up the project I was involved in with Bill, by the way, because I know that there were only 12 families in ours, and I know that nobody in there, that not a single one of those had an experience of childhood bereavement. Those are the ones from Timescapes. Not been a terribly happy experience going back to the Timescapes collection, but I perhaps talk about that later on. The British Library, we've heard about already, a number of very large collections there. Look at that, over 6,000 items in the Millennium Memory Bank, and then down to smaller ones. And then we've got some crossover because the fishing community one is saved in both the UK Data Services and at British Library. And the Imperial War Museum, potentially huge as I've put. And we'll talk about that again later about searching, but I think I've got it down to about that possible number. And then the regional oral history collections, of which there are many, and these are the ones I've looked at so far. And again, they vary greatly in terms of size and in terms of their structure. But as you can see also, I'm saying this is regional. Of course, I haven't gone outside England so far for this. But anyway, that's to give you an idea of what I've been looking at. And what are my observations so far? Well, one is very much is the variability of the types of collection, forms of preservation, amount of linked metadata, their searchability, and the significance of time. So I'll just look at those in... Oops, that's gone a bit funny, hasn't it? Anyway, never mind. The types of collection, well, I've given them, I'm sort of loosely grouping them as academic, thematic, and community. By that I mean there are collections which are based on someone's research project. They've been set up rather like the project that Jane, that I'm working with, has set up, with an aim, with a purpose to explore a research or a group of research questions. So they're structured around and they're generated by a body of theory, and the aim is to contribute to knowledge. And not that the others aren't there to contribute to knowledge, but in a particular way, in an academic research way. Other types of collection are much more themed, and I suppose I'm thinking there of some of the British Library collections where we've got interviews with groups of photographers, the publishing industry, Tesco's, the city. They're strongly themed around perhaps particular activities or particular kinds of life experience. And then the ones I loosely call, which may also overlap, of course, with the themed ones, which are the community projects, which might have been funded over the last 30 years by Manpower Services funding, now by Heritage Lottery, very much located in a physical environment, sometimes around groups, around particular types of ethnicity, particular kinds of experience, but in the most they're kind of localizable. And then forms of preservation, well, we've already been hearing about changes in forms of preservation, and those are reproduced in the forms of recording. They're reproduced in the collections as well, some of which are audio cassettes with very brief details, and then fully digitalized, transcribed data with sound as well. And sorry, I don't know what's happened there. Assembled collections, right? Things put together versus some things which are just simply lists of audio, or particular pieces of audio. For example, thinking of the Hampshire Records Office there, if I put in death and child, I can't remember whether I could put in both. So I only put death in that one, or maybe death and child, which are the two keyword searches I've been using. I'll get a whole list of things, including radio Solent broadcasts, because it's a sound archive. It's not just an oral history archive, it's a sound archive. So they collect everything about sound in Hampshire. So I've got, radio Solent, somebody, I don't know what it was now, but various items, might be in the death of Nelson, program about the death of Nelson, probably was, alongside other people talking about family being interviewed, local projects in Basingstoke, for example, people talking about family life, in which someone will say their mother or father died as when they were young. So very kind of hit and miss in that way, in terms of how the data is presented to you. I'm thinking about those different types of collection as well. What, of course, is so fascinating about this is that I'm just going back on myself as I'm looking at my notes, of course. The community ones tend to be very topographic. They're topological. They're very, very focused on people and place. So the interviewing is around space and perhaps people who are representative of that community. And they tend to be less reflective because of this, and also because, of course, if they're HLF funded, the work's got to be done quickly and got in. So not much time, really, to spend thinking about how the interviews are going to look in the archive, or even around the interviews as well. And sometimes it sometimes feels as if the individual has been somewhat subsumed into the collective memory of an area or place. And I was struck by this is just completely fortuitous, that when I was reading the Ambleside's wonderful online collection, I came across a friend of mine whose partner was the poet in residence at Dove Cottage. And she's interviewed about the setting up of Dove Cottage, which is a very, very, in a way, quite amusing interview. Local people, when they first arrived as a young couple, funded by MSC actually, to work at Dove Cottage, local people were saying, well, who is this Wordsworth anyway, it's not that important. And there's a kind of local resistance to the development of Dove Cottage. And I'd happen to know, I can name her because she's named online, Mags Labour. She's a personal friend of mine. What doesn't come out in the interview, that the reason that she left Dove's Cottage was that her husband, a young husband, died on Scarfell Pike of a heart attack. And that's mentioned in passing. And there is a story of death in childhood, not from her children's perspective, but she talks very much about this in her own, her life stories. She talks as a friend, but it's not in the archive. So tantalisingly for me, I know that there's some experience of a family dealing with death in childhood, but because that particular collection is about Ambleside and the Lake District, that story is somehow lost in the community representation. So I'm not criticising it, I'm just saying this is if serendipity comes up against blocks now and then, and it was simply because I knew about her story that this occurred to me in that situation. And again, serendipity is always present, and I think the thematic ones often present unusual ways that one might not have thought about. In the Hampshire Record Office collection, there's a project on home dressmaking. And when I put up funerals, I got a lot of stuff about practices around funerals, and which Jane is also interested in. So you can't go by the heading of a collection. Some of these themes produce surprising insights and data that one couldn't have thought about. And again, of course, totally surprising, as one might think within the Ambleside collection, are the Kindertransport stories, all about children and death, because that's where a large group of the children from the Kindertransport were taken in the late 30s, during I suppose 1939 it was, wasn't it? And was settled in the UK. So surprising what one finds, and I suppose one has to keep a completely open mind about what collections will provide. The forms of preservation, as I said before, are very, very different, and one of the disappointments, of course, is that the Elizabeth Roberts collection is not digitalised at all. It's totally hard copy. And this is, it makes, and I can see from their visitors' book that it's been greatly used, and I know other people have used it, but it is not, and doesn't seem to be in the near future any possibility that it is going to be digitalised. But let's see, life can change, can't it? So to move on to searchability, well, I mean, I have to confess, much as I go on about reuse and secondary analysis, I either feel de-skilled or I'm not skilled enough, but actually devising ways to search these many different collections I found quite difficult. Every single one has a different interface, it seems to me. Every single one has a different way of dealing with keywords. Some will combine keywords with an advanced search and some won't. So you've got to learn your way into each collection. And sometimes it's helpful and sometimes it's not. I actually found that the Imperial War Museum was a very difficult one to search, and I had to write to them to ask how to do it, which felt pretty shameful, really. But and having done it, I don't even think it's that straightforward now. I don't know whether other people will concur with me. Wonderful, brand new space they've got online there. You have to get inside the heads of the archivists, that's the thing. You have to know how they think. Not how they think we think, but we have to get inside their heads, how they manage their data and how they think about it. And this was quite interesting, actually. Rob Perks, when I was talking to him about this, he said one of the things you've got to think is when you're looking at summaries, you've got to think about how do people summarise. So you search according to the summarisers, not according to what you think you're going to find there. So that was a useful tip for me, actually. So some of the collections offer the briefest descriptions. I mean, just simply, it might be interview with Mr. or Mrs. X. You might get a date, and it might be the name of the project, and it might be the topic. And then others will go into a lot of detail, very, 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 wonderfully searchable summaries, which I've found very, very helpful. But some of them very large, and at this stage I obviously didn't want to have to read. For example, the NLSC gave me 760 hits after I put in child and death. So I looked at the first 200, and then in another one, which was a large set, I looked at every 10. It's very hit and miss. The Millennium Memory Bank with the 6,000 interviews with death gave me 2,384 hits with death. But that was partly because one of the programme themes that makes up the Millennium Memory Bank collection actually has death as a topic, so it's kind of overproduced in a way. I searched every 100 in that one, and that gave me 17 titles, as they call it. So some of the searching I found very straightforward and very easy, some not so easy. The problem is death as a search term gives you a lot of overproduction, partly because in ordinary everyday speech, it's there. People talk about frightened to death, scared to death, and it came up again and again and again, so overproduction through language. And managing the large collections, certainly, as I say, the strategies, I think, whether ultimately that's how Jane might approach it, I don't know. To take a sort of random selection like that may or may not be a good idea, and then double thinking the summarisers' approach, as I mentioned. But I think one can be helped and hindered by the original researcher and archivist, in this case of Elizabeth Roberts, who very, very systematically, wonderfully actually, produced a whole list of search terms, and everywhere these search terms appear in her transcripts, she's got a page number, so you can go to the interview and find a page in which this is mentioned, which is great. And she did that for her first set of interviews with death as a topic, lovely. but then she didn't have death in her second set of interviews, and I just don't know why. It's just not there at all. I mean, exactly the same interview schedule, but when she came to actually set it up to be reused, thinking ahead, I mean, how many researchers actually think like her about who's going to use the collection later on? I mean, that's a wonderful thing to have done. But you've got to think inside Elizabeth Roberts' head as well, because that's the way those are the topics she chose are the ones that interested her, or maybe they're part of her own, what she was thinking about at the time. And also, of course, if you can't cross-reference, as you can't in hers because it's hard copy, you've got death unrelated to other things. And in fact, of course, it might or might not be related to, for example, someone's pet rabbit. She's got rabbit as a topic. And I suddenly thought, well, somebody could be really, that could be a whole story around a death of a pet rabbit, couldn't it? But I can't find it. It probably isn't there. But it just occurred to me, it might be something. And of course, as well as that, it's the dangers. I can remember discussing this a while back when we first started bringing in things like, using digital means to searching data sets. If you only use keywords, then you miss the whole rhythm of the interview. You miss the length of the story. You miss the way it comes in and out of it. So you must not be content with just that keyword search. And again, I was looking at the Elizabeth Roberts collection where I could see the full transcript, even though I couldn't search it digitally. She, for example, gave me, I think it was in one of the interviews, page 3, she gives a reference to parents dying. But actually the story began at the start of the interview, the very start. And in another case, the first question, or the second question that the interviewer asked, probably Elizabeth Roberts, what kind of house did you grow up in? The interviewer immediately says, it was the house she was born in, and it's where her mother died in childbirth. So you have to sort of you have to contextualise that reference with a much longer narrative within the interview. So there's that's a danger, I think, of the keyword search approach. And then significance of time, and I'm saying this in relation to the collections themselves. There have been changes in oral history, although a lot of us would resist the typification of oral history as being rather empirical and positivist at the start. I think we have to say that we were quite into that. We were trying to establish ourselves as having or producing evidence which was as good as anything documentary. And so we were looking for that data, for that hard evidence. And I think in those early collections, there is very much that feeling. And of course, as well, somebody like Elizabeth Roberts, I'm going back to her, and possibly, I'm sure, also the early Paul Thompson studies. These are social historians. These are people actually trying to get at the fabric of lives. And so the Elizabeth Roberts material, and I think she's typical too, and I look at my own interviews in the 70s and I find it too. It's very much about material aspects of life as indicators of things like social class, things like gender relations. So, for example, she asks people what food was put on the table. What were the floors covered with? And this gives you evidence. It gives you information about those types of family. But those are how the interviews appear. Well, they certainly appear to me. They're less reflective, I think, than the longer interviews, which certainly the British Library NLSC interviews produce in the 1990s onwards. And of course, much less reflective than, say, the Timescapes collection, where we were investigating or learning from people about the qualities of family life, experiences of change in family life. So I think, the disciplines themselves have changed over the years. And I mean, for me, the fascination of oral history is the coming together of these two disciplines, history and sociology. And the way the two cross over and feed each other gives you insights into how those disciplines themselves change or reinvent themselves. I think there's been a growth in the range and type and form and rationale for community initiatives and funding. And if you look from MSc to HLF, I think that there's a difference in the type of project which is now funded under HLF, which I think wasn't funded under the Manpower Services Commission in the 1980s. I think there's more thematic work going on now than possibly there was in the MSc period. And of course, we now have commercial sponsors. I haven't yet looked at any of that stuff, although I suppose in a sense it's there in the NLSC collections with the commercial sponsors that they've worked with, to what extent that kind of sponsorship changes the nature of oral history making and therefore the collections, I don't know. And then, of course, also the role of broadcast media. I think implicit in that is people's own understanding of what oral history is about. People know about it now. We don't have to tell people what oral history is or explain it. It's part of everyone's life. It's a normal turn of phrase, or it's a normal phrase that people use. I don't know when people feel that change happened. I think it's happened in the last 3 or 4 years. I think it's as recent as that I now no longer have to say to someone what oral history is if I say I've been an oral historian. I might just say it's exploring the past through memory. That's enough. But before, it wasn't something that people were so aware of, and I think that people's awareness of it feeds into the interview process. So the interviews themselves become different. So I'm thinking ahead and thinking back. I think we're looking at changes in the nature of the collections and the way they're made. I think also the Funding Council's approach is interesting, and Graham and I in the Oral History Society and others, we're both rewarded and frustrated by the Funding Council's interest and attention in oral history. It's absolutely wonderful that so many academics are interested in oral history now, but what's not so wonderful is that it's not supported either at a teaching level or certainly in research methods. So we all know it's about impact, because what better your oral history part of your research than to show evidence of impact and engagement. So good news, let's make the best of it. And then neglected themes. Well, these are very white collections I've been looking at, very, very white. With few exceptions, East Midlands Oral History Project, East Midlands Oral History Archive has a number of collections which specifically directed at certain populations, Sikh community in Leicester, for example. But they're mostly very white. Somebody can pull me up on this, and I know that there must be many collections or many projects which don't fit that bill. But are they archived? Where are they? I'm not sure. So again, please correct me if I'm not putting over the right information there. Bradford. Yes, I should look at Bradford. You're right. So let's go back to Paul Thompson's choosing or finding suitable collections and just wonder about the points he's making. Because first of all, I thought, it's not possible. These are not things that I find are possible, but maybe what we do is we modify these 3 possible criteria that he's putting forward. They're certainly not a sample. These collections I've looked at, with the exception of the ones I'm calling academic, these are not based on what you would call a sample recognised within the discipline of social sciences. They're not drawn up in any systematic way. They're just who do people know and where do people live and who does somebody else know. At best, I think you would say they were snowballing, or you might put out an appeal locally and people will come forward. So they might fall within the snowballing category of more academic methodological descriptions. But they're certainly, I wouldn't say they would pass muster in outside any other context. But maybe it doesn't matter. I'm beginning to feel it doesn't matter, and I think the notion of that Jane draws up between the sort of voluntary and spontaneous interviews is something we might want to take seriously and value. The interviews are free-flowing but follow a life story form rather than focusing on the researcher's immediate themes. Well, yes and no again. Some of these collections clearly have been fairly free-flowing, but others not. And now, what's interesting about the Imperial War Museum collection is now that many of their interviews, although they're only summarised online, the actual interviews are available to be listened to. And I'm sort of quite shocked at the very abrupt way in which people begin the interview. Somebody's name, and not many of them don't ask them when they were born. So I've no way of actually situating when this person, I could possibly, if they're talking about wartime experience, I could probably locate them, but, were they young then, or were they older? I don't know. But fairly abrupt interviewing style. Certainly, you know, the aim is to get the story out, isn't it? And these are certainly some amazing stories there. I mean, certainly in terms of conflict, but also again going back to some of the Kindertransport refugee stories in World War II, absolutely extraordinary life stories. So I wouldn't say that one always has a free-flowing account, and certainly I think some of the quite focused community projects, not very free-flowing at all. These are people who know they've got a story to tell and who have been asked to tell that story because they're known locally. One has to make a judgment. Does it or doesn't matter? But sometimes the personal stories will break through, particularly if someone wants to talk about how their life was changed by an experience of death in childhood. You know, relocation, sent to live with a grandparent, going up, going down, and you know, social scale and various things. These things will emerge and come out, but they're not going to be the focus of the interview, and it'll be the persistence in a way of the interviewee if they do. And thirdly, when recontact's not, well, I mean, that's just hopeless, isn't it? It's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen. I mean, we have to just be, I mean, some of us, I don't know about you, David, I didn't even give out permission forms when I was interviewing in the 70s. Did you? No, I didn't. I was quite ashamed when I went back to look at my collection. I kept very, very brief notes of what I was doing. So that would be one, apart from which, of course, they're all dead. Although they may have, you know, surviving relatives who would want to have something to say, but we're not going to go back. So I think they're interesting criteria, but they're not realisable. And in revisiting them, I'm not trying to criticise the collections I've looked at. I just want to have something realistic to say about it. So what next can we say? What will CAPED do? Well, more searches certainly. Although actually my time's up with the consultancy, but I've got so interested in it, I'd like to continue. But we've got to work out a sampling strategy, and this is where I thought maybe people here will have something to say. Because what we don't want to get into is this notion that has been criticised of somehow what's called pooling disembodied data, that we're kind of bringing together data from randomly selected, it appears, a set of collections, and putting it together. And none of these interviews will share very much at all in terms of how they were generated, who the interviewers were, who the researchers were. They are being selected and taken out of context. I haven't said much about metadata, but many of the collections I looked at offer very, very little information about what the project was, how it was generated, and how it was funded. So virtually, some of them are they're almost like little naked interviews. There's nothing you can say about that person apart from what they say on the tape, and nothing about the project apart from maybe the title of the collection. So we are doing this risky thing of pooling disembodied data, but I think it's quite an exciting thing to do, so I like a bit of a challenge. I think there must be a way around it. And the way I've thought about it, and sort of Jane and I have been discussing it, I mean, it's not my project, and so in the end it's going to be other people who will do this, I think is to perhaps go back to the sort of approach which Paul Thompson took up in the first study that he did at Essex, the large study, where he drew up a theoretical sample. And I think the richness of the collections around the country that I've looked at make that possible. It will be possible to look for differences of class, differences in terms of ethnicity, I hope in the end, differences of place, differences of types of experience within families, and to, having done a search of the collections, find the interviews to put into those categories. And to me, I think that's the way forward. But if anyone's got a better suggestion, I would really love to hear it, because, and I'm sure the project would too. Because just to go back to that query that the first bid generated from the reviewers at the SRC, the data are out there. There definitely is data out there. It can be used. What we need is a way of describing how we use it in a rational and accepting way, and in all its positives and its limitations, and and allowing for all the differences in searchability, because, for example, sitting at home, as you say, in your pyjamas, searching online is one thing. Going up to Lancaster and working your way through, 100 transcripts by hand, or even generating the pages that you're going to have photocopied, that's costing time, and that means money in a bid. So there are things to be balanced out in bidding. So for me, these are interesting, perhaps not all such interesting questions to you, but I think constructing a sample from these different experiences, using this one example in this case of childhood experiences of death, for me has been a really interesting, I like to use the fashionable word journey, but for me it's been very enlightening activity, and I hope to learn from whatever responses you may make to it. Thank you very much.
Joanna, that was fascinating. It was interesting that I think we needed somebody with your wealth of experience who was able to speak so frankly and actually to spell out some of the difficulties you've encountered, I've encountered, some of us have encountered, and perhaps don't like talking about it. But there are real problems. And I think you're challenging Paul Thompson's 3 tenets, which may have been the gospel to start with. It does make the point you're not detracting from what he was trying to do in any way by getting this thematic approach. But there are difficulties. That's basically what you're saying. And I thought that was very good. Now, I'm desperately at the same time trying to look at the timetable, which I must have somewhere. How much time have we got?
Not run over. I'm a minute over.
Well,
We have one question.
Well, I think even that might be a little tricky. Let me just be very stern chair. Let me say, I want to keep to order. You're staying
right.
for lunch, aren't
yes,
you?
Yes,
Yeah, and
right.
the invitation went out to you from the speaker. She wants to hear your views on this, and I think that let's do that over lunch, when we can actually talk about it. I think it's going to be the easiest way, otherwise it's perhaps not very fair. And so thanks very much, Joanna. Thanks. I find it fascinating, and I found my program.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm Sarah Gudgin, and up until the end of October I was the curator of oral history and contemporary collecting at the Museum of London, where I was based for over 13 years. And in case you don't know, the Museum of London decided to get rid of its oral history curators and has closed the department for oral history for the time being, and has made a number of cuts across the organisation. But I think when Abigail asked me to talk, I was sort of wondering what I was going to add to today, but having just heard Joanna talk, I can sort of give you an insight into what it's like to work with a large oral history collection, and what we do with it at the museum, or what they did. I've got to get rid of saying that. What was done with it at the Museum of London, and having worked with it, I've sort of got used to its particular foibles and eccentricities. And I've been very immersed in that work, so it's kind of nice to stop doing it and think about it in a different way. And also I wanted to just give you a bit of an insight into how working at the museum and the rapidity, how quickly we have to work on projects actually does affect what goes on behind the scenes, as it were. The museum began collecting oral history in 1985 as part of the Port and River Oral History Collecting Project, and it was a major programme of interviewing of men and women who were facing the closure of the docks. So it was capturing history at that time. But there is an oral history collecting strategy, and this is what sort of we aimed to do, what the museum aimed to do. Reflecting aspects of London's history not already covered in this collection or elsewhere in the museum's collection, collecting material with reference to a particular subject where it's London-wide or national significance, building up underrepresented themes in collection, furthering our understanding of diversity and cultures in London, and capturing aspects of the past that would have been lost or disappeared elsewhere if they hadn't been collected. So we're working to that those principles, and there are four sort of main sections of the collection. There's the Port and River Archive, the London History Workshop, the Making of Modern London, and then the Museum of London's core collection. And this comprises over 5,000 hours of live stories collected over 30 years. And it's an unparalleled resource for Londoners and London, representing the history of London in the 20th century and today. And the earliest recordings date back to the 1840s and were on wax cylinders. So they reach a very wide variety of people that have lived and worked in the capital, made London their home, from road sweepers to opera singers, policemen, protesters, housewives, Jewish rabbis. And these are sort of just going to give you a little bit of flavour for what's in those collections and the sizes of them. As mentioned, the Port and River was the starting point, and it's sort of really self-explanatory: dockers, stevedores, watermen, lightermen, all aspects of the port and the river. The London History Workshop, which was an acquired collection, it's a range of subjects: East End songs, hooligans and rebels, communism and feminism. It's lots of variety, but within that collection of particular interest are recordings by Jerry White, talking about the Rothschild buildings and the Campbell Bunk recordings, and also Raphael Samuel recording with Arthur Harding, which are 46 tapes. So he really did, do a lot of very in-depth material with Arthur Harding. And the Making of Modern London, again an acquired collection, audio interviews undertaken by researchers for the London Weekend television programme, and it's split into four main parts: 1840 to 1940, 1940 to 1939, 1939 to 45, and 45 to 85. So that's very in-depth coverage of those particular time frames. And then there's the core collection, which is what we've been doing, what the museum has been doing since the 1980s. It's a wide-ranging. It's just some of the lovely interviewees. It's wide-ranging, it's diverse, and there are some amazing stories within that. Just so that you get a feel for it, there's individual interviewees and also projects. So these were some of the projects that have been undertaken in time that I've been there, in fact. So, a great variety of subjects. The Blitz, world faiths, Jamaican photographers, LGBTQ histories, women liberation, and some of the projects that we've been working on lately, a project on human trafficking, and then collecting London Olympics and Paralympic Games. And I think something you said made me think, something Joanna said made me think about the Olympic Games, because these had to be done very, very quickly. They were with people who'd worked behind the scenes at the Games, and former Paralympic athletes as well. And, because the way the museum works and wants to deliver its materials, I felt when I was doing those, yes, we were focusing very much on the Olympics, but perhaps there wasn't the time to really give the context. Sometimes there wasn't the time to get the context of a person's life because we were focusing particularly on a subject. And that's one of the issues that comes out in a lot of these subjects. We do cover context, but sometimes in the museum, the desire to display things influences how and what you collect. So I was just sort of thinking about the strengths and weaknesses of the collection. So lots of Londoners of all walks of life, classes and backgrounds. It's wide-ranging subjects and themes. It's hugely multicultural. So I think Joanne was mentioning, it's not an overly white, if that's the right word, collection. It's very diverse in its cultures, and a number of languages have been recorded in. And for as far as the museum goes, it's the most diverse of all of its collections, and inclusive of people that aren't mentioned anywhere else or are marginalised in society. So just to kind of stress the strengths of the collection. Some of the weaknesses, which I'm going to talk about more in this talk, is back behind the scenes. Really, it's intense periods of collecting have resulted in large but sometimes patchy collections. Material collected in the past, it didn't have copyright clearances, it didn't have summaries, it didn't even have transcripts, so it's very poorly documented. And it doesn't reflect enough on specific time frames. So 1970s to the present day aren't that well represented, and that's probably due to the age of some of the people that we've interviewed. And also, in a weaknesses, it's very, we're calling ourselves the Museum of London, but it's actually difficult to reflect all of London or its people, and even its subcultures. But these are things that curators have to deal with. So, how the museum works with it? Obviously, we catalogue it, we use it in our galleries, publications, community history projects, and online. And I guess it sort of comes back to how people manage to access this collection, and how the curator can be a very important pinpoint really on all of this. So let's go on. So I'm going to talk now about how it began. This is a very old slide from a project that the museum did in the 1990s, the Peopling of London exhibition. I'm sort of a little bit embarrassed that we still talk about this, but it was such a groundbreaking project at the time. The museum was working with communities to collect stories about their experiences and objects that they themselves had determined, rather than from the curator's point of view. And 100 oral histories were collected, and you can see how it's displayed here with the handset. And today, that the museum wouldn't show oral history in that way, but it's almost a sort of timepiece of how oral history used to be displayed in museums. And it was an important part of our learning process, and from this I think the museum really began to understand how important oral history was going to be in its displays. So I'm going to talk about several different projects which demonstrate how oral history has been, practices have evolved and been used at the Museum of London. Briefly, the London Voices project, 2 examples of artists' work, and the Belonging exhibition. And also I'm going to talk about the Recorded Media project, which is helping the museum to make its collection more accessible to others. So, the London Voices project was an HLF funded project. It's when I came on board at the time at the Museum of London as well. And the idea was that we were going to deliver innovative oral history projects outside of the museum, because what we were seeing was we had this massive collection, it was really interesting, but not enough people knew about it and not enough people were using it. So we had to deliver 6 projects, or was it 8 projects, I can't remember now, per year, taking oral history in new directions. And this, believe it or not, was one of the innovations of the time. It was an exhibition where there were no objects, and it was all about oral history. So some of these terminals were displaying a database of oral histories, which at the time was very innovative, and this is before people were using the internet to deliver oral histories as well. And we demonstrate, I think, it was quite cutting edge, and it was a brave experiment, and there was quite a lot of resistance to it. I remember discussions at the museum, we can't have an exhibition without objects, but it was a success, and it demonstrated that oral history could lead an exhibition rather than just always in the supporting role, supporting objects or supporting another narrative. So it helped to reposition oral history at the Museum of London. And just so you wondered what they were looking at, this is the database that those people on the terminals were looking at. It was 19 interviews, 300,000 words and 5 themes. So it was a heavily curated, or cooked was somebody's word earlier, heavily curated use of oral history online. And I don't think we do that today. Firstly, we don't have the time. And secondly, I think we want the raw data, we want people to engage with the raw interviews rather than through curated groups. This is a sort of screenshot of the London Voices projects, which I was working on back in the day. It shows you a variety of projects, colour contacts, which I'm going to talk about, a touring exhibition, postcards of I don't remember back in the day when you used to be able to get postcards at cinemas, free postcards, and we put lots of oral history on them and links to our website. There were different projects and different ways of making our collection known to others. And working with communities has been a very big part of the success of the oral history department. We've worked with, African, Caribbean, Tamil, Asian, Irish elders, Polish, you name it. It seems like we've worked with lots and lots of groups across London. And for many people who take part in those projects, the fact that we're valuing their story helps them to value their own story. And you were saying about people thanking you. I mean, it's so humbling that somebody should be giving their time to you to tell their stories. But that is one of my experiences too, that, people thank you for listening to them. And, you feel like it should be, it's definitely the other way around. But it's an important part of the success of delivering material at the museum. The Lewisham Voices project, again, was a very big community project based in Lewisham, where I went out and worked with 16 communities, gathering their stories, their personal photographs, and the stories behind their photographs, which were put online. I'm romping through this because I know I've got a lot to get through. So working with artists, perhaps a more interesting way of working than some of the others, I think, now. And it's because in some way the role of the artist is not too dissimilar to that of a museum curator. They're observing and analysing, interpreting and presenting. However, I think artists arguably have an additional freedom that comes from being less bound by expectations of objectivity or neutrality. But a very interesting experience working with artists. And the two projects that I'm just going to briefly talk about, one was where the artists worked with the collection, reusing the collection to interpret, and another was a collecting project with an artist. So, starting off, hang on, if I go back, I'm right. This is the collecting project that we did with the artist Graham Miller. Back in 2000, we collaborated on a project to produce a sound installation and a sound walk called Linked. Graham and the museum worked together to collect 65 oral history recordings, totalling approximately 100 hours, of interviews of people who'd lived in an area previously occupied by 400 homes and houses along the M11 motorway. This was a road that was completed in 1999 amid dramatic and passionate protests. And the recordings document the campaign and also the responses and experiences of the road that's the people in the community that are no longer there. So they're not actually, interestingly, they don't all follow a life history format. So sometimes they're almost like a kind of, a vision. Someone's imagining their former home. I'm standing in a room, I'm looking around, my friends walking in. It's not a life story. So they're quite interesting, sort of diversion, really, in terms of the traditional oral history format. And the recordings were edited to create a sound walk along the site of the former houses, and 20 low-power transmitter units with sound stores were attached to lamp posts, and they work in all weathers. In fact, I think they're still working today, but people could pick up the sound headset and walk along the route, and the receivers would pick up the sound from the lamp posts, and you could hear the sort of ghostly voices of people that used to live in the houses that were no longer there. And I suppose today, with the QR codes and smartphones, one way of doing that today would be that we wouldn't use the headsets, we'd have it on our phones. But it was an innovation of the time, and the oral histories and the archive of the protest are still to be found at the Museum of London. And colour contacts, a slightly different way of working with an artist. group was a collaboration, a commission with a dance group called Bija, who do South Asian dance form called, I'm going to struggle with this word, Bharatanatyam, a stylistic dance form where this group came into the museum. They listened to voices from the archive and people's experiences of migration and settling in London, and they created a narrative and a dance piece that explored those experiences and a soundtrack of the oral history extracts. And we then took the performance out into external venues, a shopping centre, underground centres, underground station, a Mela festival in a park, so that we exposed people to different audiences. And it was a really interesting experience working with artists. They brought their own perspectives, and reflecting on their use of the material was really enriching for everyone who was taking part in that. Now, another important development was this project, the belonging. So, I mean, ultimately, the London's Voices projects reinforced our belief that oral history had very popular appeal and encouraged engagement on a very personal level, and we could tackle some really challenging subjects, and that we could present oral history in much more innovative ways. And after Voices finished, we carried on doing other projects, but in 2008 there was the culmination of a 2-year project working with the Evelyn Oldfield Unit, an organisation that supports refugees in London. And the exhibition and the project looked at the experiences and contribution of refugees, and we entered into a sensitive debate about the subject. We recognised the importance of offering a much needed positive image of refugees, and oral history allowed us to explore their life and their stories. So this is just how the project was put together. Partnership with Evelyn Oldfield. It involved 15 refugee organisations. There was a steering group made up of field workers who were recruited for each of those refugee organisations. 160 new interviews were required, and there was a great deal of participation with the steering group, refugee organisations and Evelyn Oldfield and the museum to develop the final exhibition. And it was a hugely collaborative and positive outcome. That's the exhibition, that's how it looks. So if you think back to the handset, we now we've got sort of interactive tables, people listening, objects, images, digital, video. There were 3 pavilions inside the exhibition, and oral history offered a variety of ways to engage with the material, so multiple choice selections, tables like here, objects, and etc. And interesting, the aim of the exhibition was to have 2 audiences, refugees and obviously the general public, and it had a clear social purpose, not just presenting oral history but engaging Londoners to think about themselves and to learn more about communities at a time of hostile reactions and stereotyping about refugees. And it was important that refugees felt acknowledged and understood. Just a few more images to look at. There was lots of press coverage. It was very positive, and I felt, the museum felt that they were effectively entering into the debate rather than just reflecting it, providing a platform and acting as a catalyst for national debate. And so, again, we demonstrated that oral history, worthy subjects, could bring in visitors too. So, moving on. Now, just in the galleries of modern London, so if you were to visit the museum today, you would find oral history in the new galleries of modern London. So I'm just going to highlight how these look and feel. So that's the galleries of modern London. It's been open some time now, I think 2010, but it took 5 years of work to produce the galleries as you see them now, with 11.5 million Heritage Lottery grant. And we wanted the galleries to show the foreground, the experiences of Londoners themselves. So the approach personalises history, and reflects multiple perspectives by revealing stories and experiences and opinions of Londoners from all walks of life. Firstly, this is how some of the oral history features in the gallery. So we've got video portraits here. It's an installation that features people from a range of backgrounds talking about their personal values and about identity, and it's juxtaposed with talking heads from a series of films made by Peter Davies in the 1960s, so it offers interesting and contrasting juxtapositions. There is a Capital Concerns, which is an audio interactive that focuses on 6 debates which are challenges for London: energy, climate, homelessness, entertainment, religion and schools, death and disposal of the dead, and identity and integration. And this is a sort of signature piece in the gallery. It's the war exhibit. It's an immersive audio display on the Second World War, where oral history and eyewitness accounts of the war come to life with powerful sounds and music of the period, historic photographs. So it's very atmospheric and intimate, and there's ambient sound as well. And in the middle, a single potent object, the V2 bomb, symbolic of the destruction of war. So that's a sort of 15 to 20 minutes of sound there in that section. Another picture of it. So oral history is allowing us to engage, and for people of all ages to engage with the past in that way. And lastly, the London Liberationist Interactive, which presents 6 short films reflecting on the movements of the 60s, 70s and 80s for women to gain social and economic equality, and for LGBTQ people for social and legal equality. So this is where the museum started doing video oral histories, and those were about 3 or 4 hours long. And these were edited together with historic images, personal photographs, newspaper cuttings, to create an interactive where people can learn about those experiences. So just whizzing on, access and research. We're approaching the end of the presentation, but just to look at how oral histories and the archive has grown and evolved, and how the museum has worked with and developed oral history projects and displays. I'm going to consider sort of how the problem of documentation has been tackled behind the scenes, really, and just thinking about another project at the end, which you might not have heard about, which is quite interesting. So this is like kind of welcome to the back room at the Museum of London. There's that flashy end at the front, but there's all this kind of muddle at the back, which as a curator I've inherited and tried to make sense of during my time there. But the collection's been worked on by a lot of people over time. It's been collected by different people over time with different standards. The older stuff, lots of it is gathered dust because it's paper only. Unfortunately, the more modern stuff, the core collection, we've improved the documentation and we've made that much more accessible. But a lot of the Port and River and the London History Workshop, it was only paper. That was it. It was paper documentation. So it had to be uploaded and captured and put onto the museum's database, which is called Multi-Mimsy. I don't know if anybody's had the pleasure of working with Multi-Mimsy, but it's a little tricky at times. And so this, the sheer volume of paperwork has made some sections of the collection very difficult to navigate, access and process. And we did an audit in recent years in which we looked at what was in the collection, what needed doing to the collection, and we made a bid for funding from the Esme Fairbairn group to carry out a project called the Recorded Media Project, and this highlighted issues of concern and preservation, and we started creating electronic versions of this on a heavy resourced project. It was very time consuming, and it's still not finished out, even as I left. So just for the Recorded Media Project, just very briefly, some of you may recognise these objects. These are some of the formats that we've been recorded in, reel-to-reel, mini-disc, digital. And one of the things that the Recorded Media Project did was digitise the entire collection. I thought someone was speaking earlier about, was it you, reel-to-reel, the difficulties of obtaining equipment that you could play back on. That was one of the challenges, and then digitising this very fragile recording. So all of the collection will be digitised very shortly, and it's all backed up on a secure password-controlled server. So the fact that we can now play those reel-to-reels is a real achievement, and the fact that we listen to me, I'm confused. The museum has made efforts to tackle the extensive issues of documentation to support that means that it's going to be more accessible to more people. But it is a pickle, and there are lots of issues with digitising, and that this is some of the project of deliverables for the Recorded Media Project. So digitising the collections, reviewing the collection, prioritising what needs to be done, secure long-term future of the collections, increasing access, and developing in-house expertise. I'm going to rump on because I don't want to stop there. Access and research, yeah. So if you were coming to the Museum of London to look at the collection, it wouldn't be easy to find things, and it's going to be even harder now because there's no curators working on it. The first point of call for research would be a multi-MIMSI database search, but because so much of the collection wasn't on that, if it wasn't in the summary, you wouldn't find it, and that's why the knowledge and of the collection honed over years of working with it from a curator's point of view. That's how it would be most accessible. I would do a search for you. You can't even search on multi-MIMSI. The curator has to search. And then it's a matter of going and looking on the shelves and finding the files, pulling them out, doing a manual search. It takes a very long time to find things if you're researching. There are then hand lists to go through, so heavy summaries. We didn't transcribe our interviews, so the summaries are at times patchy as well, although luckily the more modern stuff isn't. And then another way of finding material is collections online, and the Museum of London has over 90,000 objects which will be available on collections online, and you can search that remotely in your pyjamas if you so desire. But digitised oral history interviews were to feature on the database, and multi-MIMSI supports collections online, and it was due to problems with sound on multi-MIMSI and the fact that the museum couldn't sort out these problems has meant that oral history has not featured as heavily as it ought to have done on collections online. So whilst the curators have been beavering away to create records to go on collections online hasn't actually been able to take them. So that's a disaster for making us oral history more accessible. And unfortunately, now that they've stopped the department, I'm not sure how that's going to be resolved, but the idea was originally to have curated groups, so they would have been the cooked version of oral history, and that was too time consuming, and the resources to do that just wasn't making it feasible. So the idea was that we were going to stream collections or stream oral history on that. I hope that someday soon they'll resolve that. Now, Moving Here is a website, if you did want to find things online, Moving Here is a website where some of our collection, not all of it, are on Caribbean, Jamaican, Irish, Jewish, South Asian, Indian, Bengali, Sri Lankan migration to the UK is on that website. So some of the material is researchable, but so those are the three main things really: coming in and doing a really long search, collections online if it ever happened, and the Moving Here website. So I just wanted to think about this project, Concordia at Montreal. And when Abigail and I were chatting, I was thinking about what my ideal researcher would be, and apart from what they might look like, I was thinking about what they might offer the museum. Many researchers use the collection, and they tend to come to the museum, be either away for days or weeks, and then go away again. And we sign research forms, of course, but we ask them to share with us. That doesn't always happen. But in this project, I think this might offer a solution to some of the problems of sharing, really. Stories Matter is at the Concordia University, part of the digital storytelling at Concordia University in Montreal. It's a database tool for oral historians by oral historians as an alternative to transcription, which uses free open source software which allows for the archiving of digital video and audio materials. It also enables oral historians to annotate, analyse and evaluate materials in their collections, as well as interact and share this with others. I suppose the closest thing I can tell you that it's like is shopping on Amazon in a way, because when you go to Amazon and you shop, you see what other people have been shopping for and what they thought of it, and this is just a screenshot of that. They've used oral history interviews to share their results by applying big data methods to identify underlying patterns within, between and across oral history interviews, and in doing so open up exciting new possibilities for oral history researchers. And I just wonder whether, what people might think of this if they've looked at it, or if you haven't looked at it, whether you think, you will look at it. And I think it's a really interesting way of working, and I think that perhaps if the researchers who'd come to the Museum of London had come in and applied this kind of principle to their research, we could all be looking at what each other are doing and learning from each other's experiences and knowledge, rather than taking it away and never knowing what was discovered by those researchers. So that's my presentation. Just have a think about any questions anybody wants to ask me.
Okay.